Thank you so much to our bell ringers. It's likely you have heard something thus far in your life. In fact, you might have heard it even repeatedly and perhaps operated under the notion that it's true, but I'm here today to correct it to you, to say that it's actually false. And what you have likely heard is this: there is no such thing as a stupid question. That is a false statement. In fact, it was originated by a person who asked stupid questions. Anyway, let me give you an example of that. The church I pastored in Charlotte, there was this sweet little lady who went there. Her name was Velma, and she was hardly big as a minute, though. She was real short, real petite, and beyond that, she was really old. By the time that I got there, she was already in her 90s, but you wouldn't know it. I mean, her hearing wasn't great, but she was very active, still working in her yard every day, would walk at least a couple of miles, and was in great physical shape. But as the years continued to pass, though, it was beginning to take its toll on her, such that in the last couple of years of her life, she had really slowed down, where the years were really accumulating and taking its toll on her body. By the time she got to be 99 years old, Velma started talking about how she wondered whether or not she would live to see her 100th birthday. Because if you've gotten that close, you kind of want to get across the 100-year line. And so she was hoping to make it to her 100th birthday, but said, I don't know if I will. Well, sure enough, she lived and surpassed her 100th birthday. But it was in that 100th year that Miss Velma passed away. And so when she died, I had shared that with the church, and at that point, I was asked this question by a couple of ladies who were kind of in shock. They said, "What happened?" I'm sorry, I don't know that I heard you. What'd you say? Well, Miss Velma died. What happened? For all the things that I do say, you have no idea fully what's going on up here. And so thankfully, I didn't say everything that I was thinking, but my answer was pretty simply this, that she was 100 years old. That's what happened. And if you are 100 years old, do you know what's going to take you out of here? Waking up every day for 100 years. Because all of those days, all of those months, all of those years take its toll on every part of your body. And it wasn't simply that she was 100, but every part of her was 100, and she was just physically worn out. Not surprisingly, there was no autopsy done, right? You don't really need to do that. You just kind of assumed, well, it was the sheer age, and her body was just worn out. Not all situations are quite like that. Sometimes you're wondering why something happens because it doesn't make sense, where an autopsy may be helpful because you're left with such questions. Let me give you an example of that on the spiritual front. You had Jesus doing 3 years of public ministry, not in isolation, but he does it specifically with 12 men that we know as his disciples. And outside of family, these are the closest people on earth to Jesus. And out of that group, these guys who seemingly have forsaken everything to follow Jesus, you have in that group a guy whose name becomes synonymous with being a traitor. Judas betrays Jesus. How does that happen? Now, that's not a stupid question, is it? I mean, here you've got someone who for 3 years has been seemingly completely vested, and he is in this, and he is serious about this, and he's been following Jesus everywhere he goes for a period of years. How is it that he winds up betraying Jesus, being a backstabber to Jesus? We're thinking about that today as part of a series we started last week that I'm calling Backstabbers. And what we're thinking about and looking at are individuals who were wearing the team jersey, who were, at least by all outward appearances, they are on Jesus' team, that they are following him and they are marching with him towards the finish line, except there is a turn and they start working for the enemy. And we're looking at how exactly that happens, but today I want to think about this very specific question. What circumstances may make it likely for someone to betray Jesus? And I think we get the answer to that question by looking at some things that were going on in Judas's life, some circumstances that were present in his life that led him to start scoring points for the enemy as opposed to staying with Jesus. Why does that matter? Because hopefully you don't want to follow Judas's example. I don't want to follow Judas's example, so we'd better answer this question. How do we answer it? Look with me in your Bibles today to John chapter 12. And almost never do I do this, but we're looking today at 3 different passages. We're doing so because the story occurs in 3 different passages. But we're going to start with John chapter 12. John chapter 12, and join me in reading starting with verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, the one that Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha was serving them, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary took a pound of perfume, pure and expensive nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped his feet with her hair. So the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Then one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was about to betray him, said, "Why wasn't this perfume sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He was in charge of the money bag and would steal part of what was put in it. All right, so here's the question. What circumstances may make it likely for someone to betray Jesus? I think the first thing that we see is this, that you'll have individuals who will allow an uncritical valuation of this life. They will allow an uncritical valuation of this life to begin and allow it to flourish. As we read this, something you need to just keep in mind, I'm sure you know it, but you need to put it back on the front burner of your mind. As we read this is not like a diary entry where you are reading what John knows as John knows it. We are reading this after these events have transpired, and so you're getting some explanations now from John who's looking back. That's going to make more sense in just a moment. But as we come to this chapter, obviously it's very late in the ministry of Jesus. The final week of Jesus' earthly life has begun, and he's had this amazing triumphant entry into Jerusalem on what we know as Palm Sunday. And during this week, though, Jesus goes back to the town of Bethany. And he goes back to the town of Bethany, specifically to the home of some individuals we read about in the previous chapter in John chapter 11. These are friends of Jesus. They are a group of siblings, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Hopefully you remember the story of Lazarus, that this is a guy that doesn't just get really critically sick, but this is a guy that dies. This is a guy who has been buried for 4 days, and Jesus goes and literally raises Lazarus from the dead. I don't know if you've thought about this, but if someone were to happen to raise you from the dead, the least you could do is give them dinner. And so that's what's going on. And Jesus is back in the home of these siblings. And just imagine what that's like. You've got the guy, you were dead, and he raised you to life. It's not simply that he saved your life, he brought life back to you. That's huge. And so having experienced this, and it's not just Lazarus has been through this, but these sisters, you remember how distraught they were about the death of their brother. They are hugely indebted to Jesus. And what happens? We're told that Mary, one of Lazarus' sisters, takes perfume. The CSB calls it nard. It's spiked nard, is the particular spice, the particular perfume, and she uses a pound of it. When you think about a pound of perfume, that's a lot. And perfume at that point was quite expensive. I mean, so we're not talking about Old Spice. We're talking about some very, very expensive stuff. And Lazarus, in his complaint about this, he puts the price on it. He says this perfume was worth 300 denarii. So what she has just poured out on Jesus' feet, that's worth a year's salary. But that's crazy expensive. And so she has done this as a demonstration of her appreciation and her gratitude to Jesus, as a demonstration of her commitment to Him, as a demonstration of her honor towards Him. She does this, and Lazarus observes this and is incensed. What? Are you serious? A whole pound of this on his feet? I mean, it's poured out everywhere. I mean, the place smells great, but are you kidding me? A whole pound of this? I mean, my goodness, that's worth an entire year's salary. And what could have happened, we could have put that on eBay, on Craigslist. We could have done something and raised some money, and we could have helped some people with this. And that sounds so spiritual. It sounds so good until we get that parenthetical thought from John, who's writing after the fact, and he says, by the way, Judas was a guy who was the treasurer for the disciples. And it wasn't merely that he was the treasurer, but when he would put money into the bag, his fingers were a little sticky. And so he would keep some for himself because Lazarus was a thief. I want you to take John's comment that he was a thief, that Judas was a thief, and combine that also with this reality that he is incensed about this lavish expense being poured out on Jesus' feet. That tells us something significant about Judas. And I've phrased it again this way, that Judas had an uncritical value of this life. By that I mean, these circumstances underscore the fact that Judas put an exorbitantly high value on the stuff of life and all that we experience here. Specifically, material things Judas viewed up here. Now, before going further, let me just state the obvious. Money is important. We need money. We need money to be able to buy food, to be able to keep clothes on our backs, to be able to get medicine, to do just the basic necessities of life. Everything requires money. And beyond that, there are things that we need, but then in addition to that, there's things that we just enjoy in life that make life a little bit easier. In truth, you don't have to have a chair, right? But it is kind of nice when you go home not to just pull up a piece of floor, right? You don't have to, but there are a lot of things in life, material things in life that make our lives easier, that we enjoy, that we value, that we appreciate. It makes life easier. And there's nothing wrong with those things. And it is not that the material stuff of life has no value, but here's the thing. We have to keep in mind that it is at best temporary, and while valuable, it is not of significant, lasting value. But here you've got a guy like Judas that as money is being spent on Jesus, he is like, what, are you kidding me? This is crazy. This is a guy who is beyond that. He is willing to sacrifice his own integrity so that he can have more money, to have more things for himself. What does that say to us about him? Again, it says that he is operating with an uncritical valuation of life, believing that the stuff of life is really up here. And when you have an unbalanced view of the things of life, and when you lose sight of the fact that when you check out of this world, everything that bore your name is still here, when you do not have that on the front burner of your mind, I'm telling you, that is a ripe environment for you, even as somebody who's wearing the Jesus jersey, to be working against Him. It is now March. Thankfully, temperature is rising, spring is upon us, and it won't be long before summer is here. I'm looking forward to being able to go back to the beach at some point this summer. And I love just being at the beach, specifically on the beach. And some of you can't imagine doing this, but I just love sitting on the beach. I just really do. I love watching the waves. I love hearing the ocean. I love the fact that the beach itself entertains all of my kids and everybody is just having a good time. It gets a little fatiguing sometimes with all the autographs when I'm out there. But apart from that, just love hanging out at the beach. But one of the things I appreciate about it, like on the beach itself, like that experience, that time on the beach, that's free. And the kids love this, that they're entertained all the way down to the youngest children. And especially, it seems, the youngest children really enjoy being on the beach and digging in the sand. I mean, where else can you get just absolutely nasty and it doesn't make any difference? They're just loving life. And so they are digging holes in the sand, and very quickly they're going to be making things. They're going to make a sand castle, and they're going to make a fort. They're going to make whatever. And so many times what you'll see is that one of them or a couple of them will have been working on something, oftentimes at some length. I mean, perhaps a cumulative point for hours throughout the course of a day. And as they are working on that, some of their siblings will operate like siblings do and accidentally step on their sandcastle, their fort that they have made. And when that happens, the victim comes crying to me or crying to Caroline saying, well, so-and-so has destroyed my castle. I've worked so hard on this and all day, and it's just terrible. And so, as they are saying this to us, one of the things that we respond is, no, that they shouldn't have done that. However, you're aware that this wasn't going to last. You know that because the ocean, the tide is coming in, and the ocean was going to wash it away. And so whether they stepped on a portion of it or not, it wasn't going to last. That's an important, in fact, I would argue that's an essential framework to keep in mind. Yes, there is stuff in life that we need. There is stuff that we value and that makes life altogether more comfortable and pleasant. But you have to ask yourself this: what is it that is really driving me? What is it that really matters to me? And you've got a guy like Judas who, it seems, is driven by the pursuit to having some and then gaining even more. In fact, it is because of that you wind up reading in Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 15, that Judas goes to the chief priest and he asks this question: what are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you? He's communicating in that statement that there is a price on anything, even following Jesus. And if you give me enough, if the material reward is high enough, I will walk away from Jesus. I can't answer this question for you, but I would encourage you to get a quiet moment and just get away from everything and say, Lord, will you help me honestly see the answer to this question in my life? Is there something, some material thing that could be given to me that would cause me to walk away from you? Lord, if somebody were to say, I'll give you that new car. If someone were to say, I would give you that house. If someone would say, I will give you that relationship. I'll give you whatever. If you fill in the blank, if there is anything that would cause you to walk away from Jesus, I'm telling you, that's putting you in a circumstance where you have an uncritical valuation of this life, and you're overlooking the fact that nothing down here is going to last forever. The other thing that you see is this in the life of Judas, that if it's not simply having an uncritical valuation of life, but if you operate in the absence of oversight. If you operate in the absence of oversight. If you would just, in my Bible, you just turn the page to John chapter 13. And we're going to look at verse 30 in just a second, but let me set the stage for you. This is after, or at the conclusion of the time where Jesus has shared the Passover meal with His disciples. And He has said in verse 26 that He is going to dip the bread and hand it to the one who is going to betray Him. And why everyone is not paying attention to this, that just baffles me. But He dips the bread, it says that He hands it to Judas, and then we're told that Jesus told him, go quickly and do what it is that you're going to do. But no one else is seemingly paying attention. This, however, is what I want you to notice, and very easily this verse could pass over you. Verse 30 says, after receiving the piece of bread, he, that's Judas, immediately left, and it was night. I mean, there's nothing in the Bible, and we have to bear this in mind, there's nothing in the Bible that's there accidentally. And so even the most trivial details oftentimes are not trivial. And I believe what we see here is not trivial, is not of no consequence. You have Jesus giving this bread to Judas, and what happens? Judas is going off at this point to meet with and to consummate the betrayal of Jesus. He has negotiated a price with the priest beforehand, and now he's going to go to him and say, hey, this is where he's going to be. This is where you can find him. In fact, I'll go and help you identify him. Before he does that, we're told that he leaves. He leaves what? He leaves where Jesus and the disciples are. So he leaves their presence, and what? It's night. I don't know if you've given a whole lot of thought about this, but when it's night, what's also true? It's dark. Especially in the first century, there's no street lights. Correct? I mean, when it was dark in the first century, it was really, really dark. And it is into the darkness that Judas goes out, and it is away from the disciples, away from Jesus, where he finally consummates his betrayal of Jesus. In that, I believe, is a very simple yet important application. That Judas's betrayal occurs when? In the absence of oversight. It is done where the very people who could have encouraged him, where the very people who would have said, Judas, do not, you know better than this, who would have said, Judas, do not, and who would plead with him. But what does he do? He gets away from them. He gets away from them, and, he does this at night. Why? So that no one will see what he's doing. Judas is intentionally seeking to operate in the absence of oversight. When we were in Charlotte, Caroline used to work for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department in their research, planning, and analysis division, and her job title was crime analyst. And what she did, and because her degree from Carolina is in GIS and mapping and all that kind of stuff, and so she was working with them, and her task was to try to identify trends and crime trends in areas and to identify hot spots throughout the city and the county. And it was always kind of interesting, some of the stuff. In fact, quite basic a lot of times, the stuff that she would come up with in some of the stories. But I remember one of the things that she would do is that in each of the precincts, there would be hot spots where they would be looking to identify trends in crime. And so she would be running all these reports and looking at all this data. And one of the things that would happen is that she would try to see, is there a particular spike in a particular type of crime? So, for example, is there an increase, for example, in personal assault? Is there an increase in theft from auto or theft from persons in a particular area? And so if you saw a trend in a particular area, that would lead somebody to go out there and start looking around to see, is there a reason for this? And oftentimes, a reason, quite simply, was this. In an apartment complex or at a park or something, there might have been a lot of theft from auto or theft from individual or personal assault. And an officer would go out, for example, during the times when this was occurring and discover, the street light is burnt out. And because of that, this area is particularly dark. And you know what would happen if you put a new bulb in the light or put a new light fixture up? Crime goes down. Why? Because human nature leads us. If we are acting out of bounds, we don't want anybody to see it. That's true of every one of us in here, isn't it? And even if you are, by profession, the most ardent, committed follower of Jesus, you and I regularly need to make sure that we are not working away from oversight, but working towards it. That we have people who will speak truth into our lives, who will help us see if we are headed out of bounds or if we are out of bounds. But you can just bank on the fact that if you are intentional in seeking to get away from the oversight of those that might hold you accountable, you're setting yourself up for a fall. Why? Because if it could happen to someone who was one of the 12 disciples, why in the world couldn't it happen to you? It happened for Judas, and it's still puzzling. Why and how could someone who was one of the 12 wind up committing this level of betrayal against Jesus? Well, in part because this was a guy that operated in the absence of oversight. The last thing I want you to see is this, that he, and likewise, we can wind up setting ourselves up for danger if we operate as if there is a return policy for your choices. Operate as if there is a return policy for your choices. If you would flip with me briefly to Matthew chapter 27, and if you can't, it's going to be on the screen here, Matthew 27. And as you're turning there, let me just set the stage for you. Judas has consummated his act of betrayal. Jesus has been with the rest of the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. The silence and the quiet of that place is interrupted in the middle of the night by the religious leadership with Roman soldiers coming in with torches and swords, and Judas kisses Jesus on the cheek. Now, he doesn't stand back and say, that's the guy. He kisses him on the cheek. He's already said, hey, that's the sign. Why does he want to do that? it's part of hiding what it is that he's doing. He wants to distance himself from the truth of what's going on. But after this has happened, Jesus has been taken into custody. There's been a series of mock trials. Jesus has already been beaten, and now there is a sentence of crucifixion, and the wheels are now barreling up Calvary because Jesus is getting ready in a matter of hours to be hanging on a cross. Once Judas becomes aware of this, that leads us to verse 3. Then Judas, Jesus' betrayer, seeing that Jesus had been condemned, he was full of remorse. And he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. I have sinned by betraying innocent blood, he told them. What's that to us, they said. See to it yourself. So he threw the silver into the temple and departed, and he went out and hanged himself. What does this tell us? It tells us that Judas was operating, I believe, as if there was a return policy for his choices. When you see in verse 3 that Judas, seeing that Jesus had been condemned, it was at that point that all of a sudden the scales come off of Judas's eyes, and he's realizing this is not exactly what I bargained for. I mean, I have turned Jesus over. They've given me 30 pieces of silver, which is not chump change, but they've given me this money so that I might turn Jesus over, like let him know when he's away from the crowds and everyone else where they could, without a riot, take him into custody. And so I've done that, and I'm just kind of figuring they're going to give him a stern talking to. He might spend a few days or maybe a few months in jail. Perhaps it is that he might get roughed up a little bit, but I think in Judas's mind, that's it. And now he's heard the next day, or within a matter of hours, Jesus is going to be hanging on a cross. He's been condemned to die by crucifixion. And at that point, Judas is thinking, that's not what I was intending to do. That's not how I thought this was going to unfold. He feels terrible about this. He feels remorse, and he goes to the chief priests, the very people that he negotiated the deal with, and he says, "Guys, here's your money. I don't want any of your money. I'm going to give this back to you. I have betrayed innocent blood. He hasn't done one blessed thing wrong. And I want to give you the money back because I want to undo all of this." That's the thought. And their response, "We don't care anything about that money. That's on you. Deal's done." Judas throws the coins to the floor of the temple, and he goes out and in a fit of despair hangs himself. Ends it all. Judas was operating as he was stepping away from Jesus, as he was working for the enemy. He was operating as though it was possible for there to be a return policy on his choices, that he could actually undo what he had decided to do. As a little boy, I was a Cub Scout, and then as I got older, I got to be a Boy Scout. I'm not saying a great one, but I got to be one back when Boy Scouts were still, boys. Anyway, I remember the first time that I went to scout camp, and for first-year campers, they had this overnight hike, and if you did this, there were a whole series of things that you would be doing as part of the process of earning a number of merit badges. And so we've all got our backpacks on, and so you've got sleeping bags and rolls and tents, all kinds of, and so big hiking backpacks, carrying a lot of junk, a lot of weight, and so we're in the mountains, and so your hike is obviously uphill. And so it's summertime, that's when you're going to camp, it's hot outside, and so you're pouring sweat, it's muggy, but then off in the distance you can hear the rumble of thunder, and so a thunderstorm is beginning to brew. As that happens, you can tell it's starting to get darker outside, and as the moments pass, it gets even darker, and then you feel the first raindrop, and then you feel the second one, and in my mind, I'm thinking, and because everything's going to be wet. And about that time, they told us all, take your backpacks off and get your ponchos out. And so we fished our ponchos out of our backpacks, and you cover up as best you can over yourself and then over your backpack. And so at that point, we keep trudging up this mountain to where our campsite is going to be set up. And you know how summer thunderstorms work. They tend to be fairly brief. And so it was, 10, 15 minutes worth of a thunderstorm. And all of a sudden, it's done. But now everything is wet. It's all hot and muggy. And you're just sweating with this poncho on. And so then you take it off. And then I discovered a basic rule of life. An opened poncho can never be put back in its container. It simply will not go. Have you ever done that? I would encourage you, if not, go to the dollar store today and buy a poncho. Take it out, put it on, and then try to put it back. I'm telling you, I don't know what it would take. I guess a robot or something. And it doesn't make any difference how neatly and how crisp all of your folded edges are. I'm telling you, that poncho is not going back in that bag. Why? 'Cause it just can't and won't go back in there. In many ways, our choices are operating the same way, in that once they have been made, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. There's no going back and saying, I have changed my mind. And once the train has left the station, the train has left the station. Now, when Judas made his decision, when he made his choice, he had no idea where exactly the train was going to be going. All he knew is that there's something in this for me, and that there was some price, some material thing that would cause him to say, I'd rather have this than stay connected with Jesus. And he sought to get removed from others who might say and plead with him, Judas, don't do this, operating as if somehow, some way, he might cross a threshold of regret and then just decide, oh no, I want to undo that. Operating as though there was a backspace key where you could undo what has been done. Operating as though there was a return policy for your choices. Regrettably, though, Judas came to discover that choices once made cannot be undone. And he made a profoundly regrettable choice, and that was to end his own life. He ended it all. Why? Because I believe he thought this: I've messed up, I've turned my back on Jesus, I regret it, I feel terrible about it, and there's no going back. I say it's regrettable because of this wonderful reality. The same person that God used to write two of the passages we looked at today, John, God also used to say this: if we confess our sins, He's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Further back in the Old Testament, you have God speaking through David in Psalm 32 to say this, as he is saying this to the Lord: I acknowledged my sin to you, I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgression to the Lord. And what? He says, you forgave the iniquity of my sin. I don't want you to operate as though choices can be undone, because they can't. And there are consequences that can be started that can't be brought back. What I am saying is this: you can be someone who is a follower of Jesus, who is actually on the team, and wind up, unfortunately, working for the enemy. And if and when you get to that point, there's no undoing what has been done. There's also no use saying, well, it's too late now. Either I'm going to end it all or I'm just going to stay where I'm at. Because forgiveness is available. That you can get back marching towards the right goal, walking back again with Jesus. Unless, of course, you'd like to follow the example of Judas. I don't know about you. I don't want to do that. You bow your heads with me?